This video may be offensive to some viewers who may consider themselves purists. You know who you are. You have been warned. Do not get upset with me for talking about engine and drivetrain swaps. I take no responsibility for your reaction and I am completely indemnified against you and your opinions. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back everybody to my complete guide to Forza Horizon 5, where I will be taking you through all my methods from choosing a car all the way to racing a car. If you haven't seen my first video as part of this series, there is a link in the description, and also there will be a box popping up somewhere around now at the top of your screen. You need to go watch that first before you go any further in this video. This video is part 2 as the title suggests, and you cannot watch part 2 before part 1. That's just how this works. I'm sorry. So now that you've watched the first video, we can now move forward with part 2. But before that, please smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more of these tutorial videos. Now, moving on, as I mentioned in the previous video, I will be debuting the first test car that I'm going to use throughout this tutorial series, and I would like to introduce you to her now. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I would like all of you to meet Ellen. No, hold on. This is not the right Ellen. Sorry. Not this one either. Alright, just let's take a deep breath here and let's try this again. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, she's a featherweight contender hailing all the way from Great Britain, and even though she looks like a pipsqueak coming up in your rear view, your pants you be shittin'.
Oh my god!
Wearing race yellow and green, she doesn't look mean, but don't be mistaken cause her moves are super clean. Introducing Ellen! Now Ellen here is going to help me explain things through this series, but I wanted her to be debuted in this video specifically because I had to make use of the conversions available for her in order to set her up to be competitive. So continuing on from part 1, where that video was about choosing a car and the questions I asked myself specifically to determine Ellen's worthiness of firstly doing a build with her, for the question of what do I want to do with this car, Ellen has been built as a super lightweight and very agile B-class road racer. The next thing I mentioned in part 1 of the series was to take a look at the stats of the car in stock form, and these weren't so good, but also taking into consideration that being a D-class car, I could still raise the car's performance by 2 whole classes until I hit the top of B-class or 700 PI. After this, I took Ellen for a test drive in stock form, and I was really surprised by the acceleration and the handling and just overall how she carries herself and shifts her weight in any situation. So what about her weaknesses then? Well, the acceleration and handling are good simply because of the weight of the car, but because of a small 1.6 litre engine, top speed was a problem. And I also had to assume that in B class the brakes would be a problem regardless of how light the car is, because I would need to pack in more power and I would need to be able to stop with that much power propelling the car forward. So with all that said, I decided that Ellen is worthy, and I did do a build out of her and she fits nicely within B class. Now then, on to the core purpose of this video, and that is discussing conversions and how they can change a car, and I will be using Ellen where possible to help explain this, but there will be other cars that I'm going to use from time to time to help me explain things as well. So the reason I'm starting with conversions is simply because it saves me time when I'm doing a build out of a car. Let's say I went through a bunch of engine and power upgrades first, but then I got to conversions and I see that there's a better engine option that I can use, then that would mean that I wasted all my time doing all those upgrades. And I don't know about you, but I don't like to waste any time in this game. Another reason to start here is because it changes the fundamentals of the car, allowing you to see how much you would be able to push it to its supposed best version. Now on to what you will actually find in the conversions menu, and remember that some of these options may or may not exist. It just depends on the car that you're looking at. So firstly, you may find engine swap options, and these options tend to be generic, but some of them can be bespoke to a certain car. Take the Bugatti EB110 for example. This car has the option to swap in the W16 quad turbo from the Veyron. Now, even though I'm certain that such an engine can fit in so many other cars, this engine swap option is only available for the EB110. Another thing I should mention is that a car's stock engine has a tendency to be weak in most cases, so much so that no matter what we try to do to it, we always somehow end up falling behind because the stock engine just doesn't have enough oomph to eat up the road as fast as the other options. So check here first whenever you're doing a build out of a car and see what engine options you can use. I myself am more of a purist, but to a certain extent. If I see that a certain upgrade option for a car will make it more competitive, then I will definitely go for that. You just need to pay attention to the cost of the PI. Also, test each engine to see which would work best for you for a certain class or a certain type of racing. Some examples I can give you is the generic 6.2 liter V8 that can be fitted in almost every car in the game. I find the 6.2 liter V8 to be a very balanced engine for off-road situations all the way down to B class, and I found that this is because of the amount of torque that this engine can produce, which leads to the car holding its speeds better than a different smaller engine. Another one that I will mention because I have a personal preference for it is the 4 liter V8 that can be found as a bespoke engine upgrade for certain BMWs. This engine works well for certain A-class road racing builds because it can get the car to accelerate fast enough, and it has a decent enough top speed to keep up with other cars while not taking up a lot of PI, and that allows you to balance out the build with the right tire compounds and some other handling parts and drivetrain parts as well. There are basically a ton of engine swaps to go through, so make sure that you try each one out because some of them may have hidden benefits. Take the rally motor swap option for example. Did you know that these engines come with higher than normal boost pressures and anti-lag? Yes, anti-lag. These engines do not need to rev to the higher rev range to produce peak boost. Peak boost comes up from down low and does not stop unless you let off the throttle or bring the rev way down low again. However, some engines do have their drawbacks. Again, with the rally motors, these engines do not have good enough top speeds. The other most important drawback to engine swaps is the PI cost. Some engines take up too much, and by the time you've added in your handling, braking and drivetrain upgrades, you have little to no PI left to add any power upgrades to your new engine. In the end, you have to experiment to find the right motor for your build. The next thing you will find in the conversions menu is drivetrain swaps. Now with these, you may find one or two different options depending on the car. If a car is rear wheel drive, you will have the option to change it to all wheel drive and vice versa. If a car is front wheel drive though, you will find the option to change it to rear wheel drive or all wheel drive. Changing a car's drivetrain can change the characteristics of a car in a big way and need a lot more tuning to the differential, and I'm gonna explain that in another video. In most cases, if you change the drivetrain on a car and you do not tune, here's what might happen. If you change from front wheel drive to rear wheel drive, you may end up with a lot of oversteer because the car previously had all its weight at the front and it was also being driven from the front as well. Now you're making the car be driven from the back, and this could be problematic because there is no weight at the back and the car was originally set up to be driven from the front. You will need to rework the suspension, the diff and the tires in your tuning menu to compensate for the massive oversteer that will come from this drivetrain swap. I wouldn't recommend doing this kind of swap unless you want to build a drift car because front wheel drive cars do have their benefits, especially in B and A class road racing. If you change a car from rear wheel drive to all wheel drive, you may end up with a lot of understeer because the car now has the front wheels also trying to drive the car, and it may end up with an imbalance where the car is trying to pull itself more than push, or in other words, the front wheels are trying to drive the car more than the rear. If you change a car from all wheel drive to rear wheel drive, then if you're not doing it for drifting or pure experimental purposes, then why? Most people will go with swapping to all-wheel drive, and this seems to be the best option. I personally went with all-wheel drive for Ellen. I get the benefit of having my front wheels pull me out the gate at launch and coming out of corners as well, and the rear wheels help me push through the middle of the tighter corners. The only cause for concern, as I mentioned above, was solving the balance between the amount of torque being sent to the front and rear wheels, and that brings me on to my next point. Tuning is crucial when doing a drivetrain swap because you will now need to balance how much power can be sent to these wheels before the driving wheels lock up. With that said, make sure you hit subscribe now and stay tuned for the tuning guide part of the series so you can see how I solved this imbalance. Moving on, the next conversion upgrade option you will find is aspirations. Remember earlier I said you should start your build with engine swaps? Another reason for that is because it may or may not give you an option to change the aspiration of the engine. Changing an engine from being normally aspirated will firstly allow the engine to produce more power and torque, but it will also change how the engine behaves. Now in here you will find at most 4 upgrade options, and they are as follows. You will firstly find a single turbocharger option, and these are nice for high output close to peak around the higher RPM range, and while that's nice, it does have its drawbacks. The way the power is brought on is very sudden when you come close to this peak or as it starts to get into boost, and this causes the engine to have some wild behavior, and you may need to work with quick steering inputs or masterful throttle control to keep the car going where you want and how you want it to. But it also depends on how much power the engine can produce versus the weight and the drivetrain of the car. So in some situations you may be able to get away with this option because the whole engine package doesn't make enough power to have this wild behavior with the car as a whole, because the car might be too heavy or you have all-wheel drive to help balance how much power is going between the front and the rear wheels. Next up, you will find a twin turbocharger option. This is very similar to the single turbocharger, but the way that the power is brought on is less sudden because the twin turbocharger setup is used to alleviate turbo lag. In some cases, the single turbocharger can actually make more power than the twin turbocharger, but with the purpose of having a twin turbo setup, the engine would rev smoother than it would with a single turbo. The same kind of conditions can still occur as per what may happen with a single turbo setup, so you still have to keep in mind that an engine with a twin turbo setup and a non-all-wheel drive build may cause the car to behave wildly in some cases. Now we move on to the supercharger options, the first of which is called a positive displacement supercharger. And this option will usually give the engine more power, but not as much as any of the turbo options. However, there are some situations where it can stack up to a twin turbo setup. The behavior of the engine will be the same as if it didn't have any aspiration upgrades, because this kind of supercharger displaces air into the engine as per what the rev the engine is at. It will build boost according to what rev the engine is at, and it will basically be 1-to-1. This means that the power will be brought on in a very linear fashion, making it a very smooth drive, and this supercharger also makes that awesome whiny noise which makes a car sound very mean and angry when it's coming up behind you. The second option for superchargers and last option for aspirations are centrifugal superchargers. I have mixed feelings about this option because this is apparently the best option in terms of power for PI, but the behavior that this brings to an engine just doesn't suit my driving style. You see, the centrifugal supercharger has a laggy feel down low in the rev range. It has a nice boost in the mid to high rev range, but when you go from high to peak, that laggy feel starts to creep back in, and with my driving style where I'm stretching each gear past redline, it just doesn't feel like it works for me. The nice part to having a centrifugal supercharger though is that it doesn't make the engine perform with that wild behavior from turbochargers, and it doesn't have a linear power and torque curve, but it is smooth nevertheless. Now we move on to the last option you may see in conversion upgrades, and this is widebody kits. Widebody kits are not just cosmetic options. They do have their benefits and drawbacks. One benefit you may find is that some widebody kits will allow you to have wider tires than normal, which will give you extra grip, and this is especially beneficial in a rear wheel drive build. Take the Corvette C8 as an example. The standard body only allows 335mm wide tires, whereas the Street Hunter widebody kit allows 365mm wide tires. Another benefit is it allows you to have front aero installed, so keep an eye out for this, especially with rear wheel drive builds, because it does allow you to have increased rear tire width, and this helps with keeping the car stable in cornering from mid to corner exit as well as on launch. The drawback with widebody kits though is the PI cost. Sometimes it just works out better to not have a widebody kit because it takes a bit too much PI and you still need to save some for power upgrades or a better tire compound, etc. It just depends on the build you want to do, and that brings me on to my next point, which is basically repetition from part 1. Choose what you want based on your preferences and your driving style. I cannot stress this enough. Also, don't just slap on a bunch of upgrades and go into a race expecting the car to do well as is. There may be some situations where this exists, but you can squeeze out extra performance from tuning, and in order to know what to tune, take the car for a test drive as per what I spoke about regarding test drives in part 1 of the series. Identify what your upgrades have changed with the car and see what needs to be addressed in tuning, or maybe a certain component just doesn't work well, or you may be able to sacrifice a certain upgrade component for something else. Basically, always test the car in stock form first, then upgrade according to the weaknesses and then the strengths if you have the PI available. Then test with these new upgrades, then tune and revisit your upgrades if you need to, and if it still doesn't work, then just look for the weak link. That's basically all you will ever do when you're building a car. Let's look at Ellen again. Her weaknesses was that she lacked power, and because of this, the top speed was also lacking. So I added a turbo to instantly give her a boost to power and top speed. Then the next issue that came up was that being a rear wheel drive car, she struggled to keep the power down to the ground when coming out of corners. And to solve that, I changed her to have all-wheel drive. The next issue that came up was a lot of understeer, and then all I had to do was balance the drivetrain, and that was that. Ellen was ready for the races. Another important thing I need to mention is if you are going to start in conversions, chances are you're going to use up a lot of PI straight off the bat for these upgrades, especially for engine swaps. Yes, changing these will make the car faster and or better, and it may work for your driving style, but you have to take into consideration that a car needs more than power to work all round. You still have to save PI for things like tires, platform and handling and drivetrain components, etc. You don't want to end up with a build that can get you flying out the gate and you running away from everyone, and then come up to the first corner and you can't even slow down because you couldn't add better brakes, or you can't get the car to grip up because your tires aren't the right compound for the speeds that you're doing and they get too hot, and you just end up with a whole lot of understeer in the end and you go flying off into the wall, or worse if you're in a street race, you know what happens then. I cannot count the number of times I've seen people do these amazing power builds and they leave me right from the start, but the moment the road starts to twist and turn, I caught up to them, and because they have serious issues with understeer, the door is wide open for me to overtake and I'm gone after that. And so concludes part 2 of my complete guide to Forza Horizon 5. With that said, in the next video I will be discussing wheel and tire upgrades and how the different tire compounds work, the benefits and drawbacks to increase tire sizes, should you change your wheels and wheel sizes, and a surprisingly big difference to a car's handling when you change the track width. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope all of you enjoyed this video, and most of all, I really hope it helps. I know we have yet to do a deep dive into tuning or the more interesting and fun things like drifting, but this guide is progressive and each one will lead into the next. I know I'm leaving huge gaps with not explaining certain things, but I need you to trust me because in the end, the whole guide will work together and it's like pieces of a puzzle that I'm putting together. The whole picture needs to make sense as one. You can't take parts of the picture and expect it to make sense. Now, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe if you want to see more tutorial or guide videos as well as online gameplay videos for Forza Horizon 5. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications so you can see the videos as soon as they come out if you like me and you're the impatient kind of person. Thank you so much for watching and I look forward to seeing all of you in the next video. Okay, bye!